So today we're at our destination, module 3, and it's really the whole point of people learning to read. It's so that we can unlock the world. And in order to use the skills that we've talked about previously, learning to lift the words off the page to be able to understand how the language works in writing, how letters represent sounds, and how we can like read through by saying the sounds that are represented and having words. That's not why we read. We don't read to just say words. We read to unlock the world. We read to understand. We read to learn. And so today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about unlocking the world and strategies for comprehension. And so we're going to go to the first slide. And the focus today is just what I said. It's while students are learning how to read, they also must be learning about the world. And initially, we do that for them, adults. We are the kind of interpreters of the world when they're little ones. We're pointing out things through oral language. We're teaching them names of things. We're taking them places and hopefully talking about it. But they also need to be empowered to be able to unlock the knowledge of the world for themselves. So learning strategies for understanding what students hear and what they read, what is read to them, is a foundation for preparing them to be able to do that for themselves. So it's just like when they see somebody riding a bike and they get taught how the bicycle works, they have to have that, and they have to have direct instruction on how to do something before they can do it themselves. And so when we talk about language and reading language for comprehension, all the things that we do with our kids up until they learn how to lift the words off the page for themselves is preparing them for that. And that's why oral language, we're going to see again, is central. And we're going to being able to comprehend what we read ourselves. And we're going to make connections back to the models that we talked about in session 1. And we also referred to them in session 2. And now in session 3, it's going to make the understanding of those models complete. So the goal of reading is not to lift the words off the page. The goal of reading is to comprehend. The most amazing thing about being able to comprehend what we read is when you have that, it's a superpower. When you have that superpower, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to have somebody else teach you something. You have the innate power to go out and find information for yourself. And in the world that we live in today, it's it's just explosive what you have access to learn. So like when I was growing up, or maybe when some of you were growing up, you only had access to, like, we had encyclopedias. It was a big deal to have a big set of books in your house, and that's where you went. You went by the alphabet. Oh, if I want to know about lightning, I'm going to go to the book that has L and find lightning. And you could only find what was in there. There was no internet. You could go to the library and look up books. But now, when you can comprehend text, when you can read and understand what it is, you want to learn how to fly an airplane or what would be involved in flying an airplane? You can go online and you can find something and you can read through it. And additionally, there's now embedded videos. So to like couple with what you're reading, you can see demonstrations. You can learn how to knit or crochet or cook. This is such, I call it a superpower because it's exactly that. You can unlock the world and learn about almost anything. So learning strategies for all types of reading is a tool that develops early on and then we build on over a lifetime. So that's kind of where we're going. So again, I'm saying it again, and the reason I say things over and over again, just so you know, this is another reading strategy. It's a comprehension strategy because adults, us, we actually need more repetitions than some kids do. So you'll see, and if you go back and listen to what we've done before, I repeat things, not saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, but saying it in different ways so that we have a better chance of retaining it. So that's something you might want to think about when you're talking to your kids. If you keep telling them the same thing over and over again, you're probably going to get the exact same results. You have to figure out how to make it work. Okay, so like I said before, without the ability to comprehend, reading is really frustrating. And so telling a kid to read it again, if they don't have comprehension strategies, is really not very smart, and it just makes the child more frustrated. So how well students can comprehend impacts the outcomes in their life profoundly. So I have some bullets on this slide, and I think they're really important. These are why I think why this organization, the Parent Advocacy Center, exists, because they know that progress, developmental progress in reading and other subject areas, of course, but reading particularly is so important, because when you are not able to read and I'm talking about comprehend, because just picking up the words is word calling, it's not full reading, it has profound impacts on life outcomes. And so that's why I'm going to spend a minute on these bullets. And the first bullet, after the top two, says literacy is a determinant of health outcomes and is associated with many indices of academic, social, vocational, and economic success. That was published in 2007. So why would literacy, your ability to comprehend, have anything to do with, let's say, health outcomes? Let me tell you why. There's a lot written on this. If you don't have basic comprehension strategies, you're probably not going to be able, in today's world, hold a job. Even this phone that I have, I have to be able to read and comprehend to be able to get all the information that's locked in the computer of a phone. If you can't read at a basic level and comprehend for the jobs that are available in the world today, you probably won't have, number one, money, and number two, and importantly in our society, health insurance. And so there have been a lot of studies that show that there's a correlation, a relationship between not being able to read and comprehend and your health outcomes, because you're not able to do those annual checkups and go and get your eyes checked and go and so it's important for our children to be healthy to be able to comprehend. And the National Academy of Medicine highlighted that the level of your education is highly dependent on reading proficiency, being able to read and comprehend, because there's so much reading involved in all the different levels of education. And that doesn't mean like college only. It means the type of education that you get as an employee when you're on the job. And so failure to be able to develop an ability to comprehend proficiently is actually considered to be a public health issue, not just in America, but globally. And that's something that people don't usually talk about. So I just want to get that out there in the beginning. When we're advocating for our children, we're not just advocating for them to do well in school. We're advocating for them to be healthy citizens and do well in life. This is long term. This isn't just a third grade or a seventh grade thing. This is a life thing. And I don't want to sound somber, but I just think that this is really important for us to wrap our heads around and understand. And so I have this little picture on the side where it says learning to read proficiently is critical to a student's entire education and predictive of future education, health, and employment outcomes. And that's something we need to ground ourselves in when we're advocating for our children. So there are 3 learning targets for today. One, for us to be able to describe the importance of language comprehension as it relates to the models of reading. And those models are going to show up a lot in today's presentation. Explain why strategy instruction is important for reading. And then for us as parents and caregivers to learn some strategies that we can use at home. Because you know what? We have to be honest, the school has a big responsibility, but our kids are only in that school for 6 hours a day. And there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in those 6 hours besides reading. Okay. Um, what do we do at home? We're busy parents, but what can we do in a short period of time, day after day after day, becomes a regular part of our lives that will have a really positive impact on how our kids do? So remember the simple view of reading? Here it comes. All those gold arrows that are now being populated with the formula that we learned, and you can just keep pushing to get all of that out. There you go. Perfect. And it's coming over. If you look, those golden arrows are all pointing at comprehension. So in that simple view of reading, the R equals D times C, that formula that we talked about, and you can go back to the recording for module 1, is reading, being a reader, is the product of decoding, lifting the words off the page, and comprehension. What kind of comprehension? Well, we refined it. Reading comprehension, now we're looking at the red, reading comprehension is the product of word reading and language comprehension. So hold that in mind. As we move on, oh, and it has to be, you can click on the next, you're gonna see 1 times 1, and click it again. If a student is lacking in one of those components, either word reading or language comprehension, the reading comprehension is not going to be achieved because it's a very simple formula. And you don't have to worry about this, but it's on there for your future use and remembrance. So let's move on to the next slide, where we see the other model that we looked at, which was the reading rope. And now I want you to look at that the golden arrow, which is leading to what's really important here. Because the word recognition, while it's hard for some kids to learn, it's the easy part. The language comprehension, where the golden arrow is the part that's going to make comprehension be possible. And so in the rope model, we're going to break language comprehension down into background knowledge. So that's why I said before, it's important as kids are growing for us to be pointing things out in the world. As we're walking down the street, as we're looking out the window, and using language to describe what it is we're seeing. Vocabulary, not talking baby talk all the time, but using whatever level of sophisticated vocabulary we have, and then explaining to kids what words mean so that they become interested in language. And so that when they hear a word that they don't know, they say, Mom, Dad, Grandma, whomever, what's that mean? That they recognize in their brains that they heard something, and eventually that they read something, and they don't know what it means, and they ask. Or as they get older, they learn how to find out what that word means, either because they learn about word structure, which I'm not going to get into right now, or they learn how to use a dictionary, or like I do, I'm always looking words up on my phone because I want to know. Language structure. How are sentences put together? And so for our multilingual learners, this is a big ask, because if you know how the word order works in your first language, like Spanish, and then you're learning English, it's a different order. And so just think, if you're monolingual, you don't have as hard a job, but you still need to understand how word order contributes to meaning. We're going to talk about that. Verbal reasoning. Not just hearing something and have it go in one ear and out the other, so to speak, but how when you hear something or you read something, does it go in through your ear or in through your eyes? And then in your brain, you start thinking about the language to make meaning. And then literacy knowledge, understanding that this book, I'm figuratively speaking, I don't really have a book in my hand, but this book is a fairy tale. This book is a real book. It's nonfiction. It's about birds. This book is a comic book. This is a mystery. Learning about all those different types of text. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but that's what we're going to talk about today. And now if we go to the next slide, you're going to see the final model. Oh, there's all those golden arrows again. And that's the tricky middle part that I talked about in the first session that we had. And you'll see that if you look at the middle part, we're talking about the same things, just in a different way, as we talked about in the rote model. Vocabulary, understanding the knowledge of text structure, different types of text, and how words are put in order to make sentences make sense. And then background knowledge, what we know about the world, what we bring to the table. You can imagine that the more we know, the better we'll understand when we're reading books. That's why it's really important to not just assume that when we're on a bus and we're looking out the window, that kids are saying, wow, there's a lot of apartment complexes around here, or, oh, we're almost at the shopping center. They're not thinking that. We have to give them language. That's why it's important. And you'll see people saying, oh, look out the window. Look at all those apartments. I used to live there when I was little. Or we're coming up to the shopping center. Oh, that's not the one that has Stop and Shop. We're not getting off until the next one. A lot of language going on in there. And that's going to help our kids when they start to read, to understand what they're reading. If you remember, in the first session, I talked about that orange box. And that orange box represents target language proficiency. So what goes on in the word decoding piece, which is the blue piece at the top, and what goes on in that middle piece, the vocabulary and text and sentence structure, that's going to be dependent on the language that you're speaking. But the bottom part, where on my slide it's pink or purplish, those are reading strategies, and it doesn't make any difference what language you're reading in. Those strategies are going to be very, very similar, if not exactly the same. Okay, so now we've seen the three models that we started out with, and we're seeing the relationship to what we're going to dive into, comprehension. And there's one more on the next slide. This is an updated, there you go. This is an updated version of that simple view of reading, and you can see it's the same authors. And you can see for reading comprehension, on the one side where it's blue, it's word recognition, the alphabet and all that. And on the other side, language comprehension and all the things that we talked about. So it doesn't make any difference what research you're looking at. You can take this to the bank. This is what the science of reading that you hear about all the time now is all about. This isn't something new. This is something that's based on years and years and years of research and has been continuously updated. Okay, so now we'll go to the next slide. If you look on this slide, I have a bunch of words in a word cloud, and these are strategies. We're not going to talk about each word on the slide. I put this here because I want you to understand that it's not one skill or one strategy at a time. When we become proficient comprehenders, which is what we want our students to be, all of these things are going on simultaneously. That's a big job. So kids are questioning while they're reading, hopefully, predicting what's going to happen, evaluating what they just read, summarizing in their heads, what they just read to see if it makes sense. Something doesn't make sense. On there someplace it says repair. They go back and they fix their thinking. Okay, so we're gonna take a deeper dive into all of these. We're gonna move to the next slide. There's a lot on this slide it's for your reference to go back to later, but I'm going to talk about it now. Speaking, learning to speak is natural. We talked about this a little bit previously, but reading and writing are not. So our brains over hundreds of thousands of years have evolved so that we learn to speak by being spoken to. Nothing formal. There's no formal instruction. Did anybody take their toddler to a special learn how to talk school? I don't think so. I didn't. I wouldn't have even known how to do that. But kids learn to speak by being spoken to because the brain is set up for language, oral language. So even though our little 1-year-olds don't speak back to us like we speak to them, they are comprehending, they are understanding most of what we say to them. And they start to use sentences sometime between like when they're 1.5 and 2 years old, little tiny sentences. And so their language develops as they get to be 2 and 3 and 4. We see that as caregivers, you've seen that with children. But if they don't get formal instruction on how to read and write, they are not going to learn how to read and write. Every once in a while, you'll read some story about some magical child who just learned to read by waking up one morning. And I've never met that child, but people talk about them. But I can tell you that all my children, they needed to be taught how to read. And if you have a child who has dyslexia, like I do, they need a lot of work. They need a lot of support to learn how to read. The word reading part. But if they've been bathed in language their whole growing up period, they know a lot about the world. They know a lot of vocabulary. They've heard how words fit in order in English. They've been exposed to books. And so their comprehension could be right on target for oral comprehension. If they could only read the words, they would be able to comprehend reading. So when we teach kids to read, they typically learn to read very simple sentences around 5 or 6. And then we have to build on from that. But it requires explicit instruction. I only have the slide up here to hit home for all of us that how important this oral language piece is. And the last bullet on that slide says that it all starts with language processing in utero, because there is research, published research that says that kids who are not yet born, they're still in the womb, can hear language and their brains are taking it in and doing whatever little brains in utero do with language, but they hear it. And I'm not an expert on that research, but I just want you to know that it's out there. So oral language is the foundation for what we're talking about. So when we move forward, I want you to not assume or misinterpret that I'm saying that, let's see, are we both on the same slide? We should be on the next slide, please. Yes, that oral comprehension and reading comprehension are the same. I am not saying that, okay? They're not the same, but oral comprehension is necessary so that we can develop reading comprehension. Oral comprehension and reading comprehension comprehension is thinking, and they're both thinking with language. Students who have difficulty with oral language comprehension, think about this. If you don't understand what's being said to you, you're going to have problems more likely than not understanding what you read yourself. Because language comprehension starts with oral comprehension. So we know from lots and lots of research that early oral language skills, however your children are developing with their oral language skills, correlates with their ability to comprehend what they read later. Reading comprehension of what we call complex text, that's the type of text that kids are supposed to be reading in school, is depending upon a lot of things, and I'm going to tell you what they are. It's on this slide, fluent application. Fluent means, and you hear this, okay, in schools, that your child's reading fluency is this, that, or the other thing. But fluent application, being able to read the words on the page fluently so it sounds like talking, is important. Because if children haven't been taught and supported with practice and guidance to read fluently, then the brain, think about this, the brain is spending so much of its energy on trying to decode the words that there's nothing left to figure out what they mean. So fluent reading is really important, and we saw it in all the models that we looked at. Background knowledge. You're going to say, hey, wow, she's repeating herself again. Yes, I am, because now this is research is demonstrating that everything we saw about language comprehension in those models is important for kids to be able to read. And if you go back and look at the assessment model, we assess all these things in school. So you should be getting information about how your child's doing. So background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge, and then the application of text comprehension strategies. So reading comprehension is much more complex. Here's another thing. When we're talking, and I'm talking at you, I apologize, but when we're talking to somebody, it's what we call in context. So we have body language. I'll be saying, oh my God, you wouldn't believe I was just, and so we have body language going on and we understand the situation that we're talking about. We can ask questions. Can't do that when you're reading a text. There's no body language. There's no, place that we're in. We can't ask questions or say, oh my God, and the other person goes, oh, just gives us a verbal gesture. There's none of that. So reading comprehension is much more complex. Let's move forward. So there's the rope again. Clearly, language is important for comprehension. I want to point out two things on this slide. It's the black lines with the black arrows. It has golden arrows next to it as well. But on the bottom, that's fluency, where it says increasingly automatic. That's what I was talking about the last time. Lifting the words off the page, seeing C-A-T, and being able to say cat instead of cat. Fluent reading is being able to say cat. So our children should become increasingly automatic. Look at the word and say it. For the language, they need to become increasingly strategic. What does that mean? Remember that word cloud that you saw on a previous slide? It had all those words of all those things. Like all of those things are going on at the same time, and children need, as they're learning to do that, they need to have a lot of practice so that they become strategic. They know when to ask the question, when to stop and repair because it didn't make sense. When to use the different strategies. There's no formula. First you do this and then you do that. And then they need to become strategic, thinking in their heads what they need to do to understand what they're reading. That is a huge job, and that's the job for comprehension. So we'll move on. There's a misunderstanding, even with us as educators, with what's a skill and what's a strategy. So sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, but they're not the same. Skills and strategies are not the same. And traditionally in schools, the reading instruction focuses on skills. And skills are things like, so let's talk about learning to drive a car. So first you'll learn how to open the door, you learn how to sit in the driver's seat, you learn how to put the key in, you learn which pedal you need to put your foot on when you're starting the car up, you learn how to, either use the shift on the on the steering wheel or on the floor or whatever who knows what kind of car you have. But those are all individual skills. You learn how to do all those little parts. But that doesn't make you a driver. It means that you know how to turn the car on, you know which pedal is which, you know how to move from drive to reverse or park, but it doesn't mean you're a driver, because in order to drive, you need to be strategic. You need to know when you're driving and a deer runs out in front of your car without thinking which foot, where you're going to put your foot, how you're going to slow down, how you're going to turn. They're not individual little skills. It's strategically putting them all together in a fluent dance that keeps you alive, basically, keeps you from hitting that deer. So strategies are intentional and complex. In reading, we have reading strategies that we apply before we read, during we read, and after we read. What does that mean? So before we read, we just don't like pick up a book off the floor or off the table or off a shelf and just start reading it. Before we read, we have strategies. Why are we reading? What do we want to find out? What's the purpose? We set a purpose. We saw that on one of the models. During reading, we're doing a lot of different things. After reading, we should be thinking about, we have strategies that we do after we read so that we can reflect on what we read and make sense. I hope that when you're listening to this, that you're not overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But rather, you're impressed with all of the things that you are doing without really thinking about it, and the workload that children have to engage in to be able to become competent readers. So we set purposes, we monitor, we're actively reading, and we need to be able to paraphrase and summarize. So there's a lot going on, but skills and strategies are not the same. So I'm not going to read through this, but these are some comprehension skills. And, learning what cause and effect is. But if you just apply cause and effect when you're reading, you're not going to comprehend. You're just going to know what was a cause and an effect in a story. There's a little asterisk, a little star on the word inferences, because inferencing can be a skill and a strategy. It depends on who you read. But when we're teaching children skills, we're focusing on immediate, simple, accurate, automatic, being able to do it. But that's not going to lead them to be wonderful comprehenders. Let's go to the next slide. They need to be able to put those skills together and be able to apply strategies. So I'm going to pick one of them, and it's going to be asking and answering questions. In order to be able to ask and answer questions, they need to be able to do many of the skills that were on the previous page. They need to be able to identify what's important. They need to be able to be looking through text and seeing if things are making sense together. We can just briefly I'll go back. They need to be able to, like, pulling out important details, identifying facts, thinking about what the problem was, in order to be able to ask and answer questions. What would they ask and answer questions about if they didn't have all those skills to be able to identify these things in the text? So this is not something that I want you as parents or guardians to be concerned about. But what I want to make sure is that you understand that when students are reading, they need to have been taught skills, but it's the ability to pull all those together and apply strategies, which are complicated and multi-stepped. And this is really where the thinking comes in. And on this slide, there's a word that we're under focus on, metacognitive. So metacognition is thinking about what you're thinking about. Think about that. That's a lot of thinking. Thinking about what you're thinking about. So we want children to be reading through and applying all these things that they're learning, and then thinking about their thinking. That's something to reflect on. So instead of repetition and automaticity, when we're talking about strategies, we're talking about intentional, higher order decision making and thinking. So that's way more complex than just applying a skill. When you're driving on a highway, or when you're driving on a road that you've never been on before, or you're driving in the dark, you need to be strategic. You need to be doing a lot of different things and making decisions. So this is intentional. You're making decisions when you're driving in a place that you've never been before. And so there's, I hope that that makes sense to people. This is this is even challenging for us as teachers when we're learning it. So don't be feeling bad if it's not making a lot of sense now. It's just so that you have an idea of what's going on in teaching comprehension. Across the decades, on the next slide, they've talked about all of this. So I want you to understand, as you see, we see 2001, 2002, 2018. People who study and work on research have been looking at comprehension for longer than the 20 years that is displayed on this slide. And so one thing I want to share with parents, guardians, and teachers is that when we hear that something has changed because of research, I want you to be able to have a mindset of, oh, now great, now they changed it. They told us this before. That really isn't the attitude that we want to have, because think about research. I don't know how many years ago, but we used to do surgery with no gloves, no anesthesia, and that was the state of the art. That was best practice. And now over just since the 80s, since 1982, when we had the HIV uh, present itself on planet Earth for the first time, that was when, believe it or not, 1984, when doctors, dentists, etc., started wearing gloves for everything they did. Before that, they didn't do that. Now, they didn't say, "Oh, all this medical science, it was useless. It was wrong. It was what it was. It was the current state of the art." And then when we learned more, we changed. And so Maya Angelou is a very well-known poet, and she says, "When we know better, we do better." And so with things that change in education or anything else, we should, I think, be happy that people are doing research and finding out more information so that we can advance what we do. But if you look at the 2018 comment, it says, instead, comprehension is the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic, that means language, and cognitive, that means thinking, processes operating on a text and interacting with background knowledge. Oh, I think we talked about that. Features of the text, we talked about that, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. So this is in 2018, these researchers were talking about how we've moved to understanding how important strategies are, rather than just focusing on skills. Strategies were always there, but now we've learned over time how important this is, and there are still debates about this, but we're going to move on to the next slide. When we talk about language, there's two ways of looking at it, because there's two differences in reading, and it's macro, meaning big, and micro, meaning small. The macro and micro structure of language and comprehension. So we're going to talk about very briefly the idea of narrative story structure. So a narrative is like a narration, a story where somebody is telling their story, like fairy tales or narratives. The types of novels that you might take to the beach are usually narratives. It's not a book where you're studying about chemistry or cooking or studying a topic. It's a story. So typically when kids are in lower elementary school, they learn that in a story there are characters, there's a setting, something happens, there's a problem, and then the story happens and there's a solution. So for instance, I could tell you a story on the phone. I could call you up and say, oh my goodness, this morning I went to the store with Jane, and as we were driving down the street, we saw a fire. Okay, so that's what happened. We saw that there were little children near the fire, so we stopped the car and we hopped out to help the children get out of the fence because it was locked. They couldn't open it. We got them out. We got them all to safety, and the fire department came. So the characters were Jane and myself. The place was the city street by a school. What happened? The problem was we saw a fire and kids were locked into an area. The solution was we got out of it. We were thinking, we got out of our car and we unlocked the gate and we got the children out and the fire department came. So that's a narrative. That's lovely, but it's not enough. It's essential. It's important, but it's not enough. We also need to teach our children, and this is something that is a focus in some schools and not in others. But this is where children who have reading disabilities and language disabilities, or I'll call them challenges, often have their issues. And this interferes with comprehension. We have to make sure that we're providing students with instruction on this. And so as a parent, I would want to be asking about the microstructure of language. How is my child learning about, and this tree that's down on the bottom, like a main sentence trunk? Reading and writing are connected, by the way. And when we ask kids to write a 3-paragraph essay or a 5-paragraph essay, when we haven't taught them about a sentence, it's pretty hard to write that essay. So the microstructure of language is teaching students about, if you look at the bottom of that tree, the main sentence trunk, that all sentences have to have a doer and a doing, or a subject and a predicate, or a noun and a verb. Whatever you've been taught, whatever schools teach is fine, but they need to understand these two parts, like dog ran. And then how do we expand the noun? So dog was the noun. We can say the very big hairy dog with 3 legs ran. Where did the dog run? So we're expanding the action. We can say the very big hairy dog with 3 legs ran slowly down the hill. That's a big sentence. How does a child understand what the parts of the sentence really mean? Now, that seems like a really simple question for us as adults, but I can guarantee you that these children are at young ages, and children who have language challenges are not really understanding that sentence the way we do, unless they're taught that. So the relationship of sentences, and I'm going to of meanings in sentences. When you say because, well, that goes to cause and effect. But if we don't teach children about the microstructure of language, cause and effect, that when we teach that skill, doesn't always make sense to them. So all of this is in the models. We're going to move on. I talked about this before, but look inside that brain. See those gears turning? To develop strategic readers, and you saw the slide where becoming more strategic, they need to use all of these strategies very flexibly. And I'm not going to read this because the ultimate goal is for them to be able to, while they're in the act of actually reading, be able to automatically, but with intention, select and use appropriate strategies to make sense. So we're going to go to the next slide. And this is the rope again. I keep coming back to the rope because I want to really beat it over our heads that this is your best friend when you're when you're going in to meet with your child's teacher. This is understanding this. This is why we keep coming back to it. And all of these skills that for lifting the words off the page, decoding the words to become automatic is so important so that your child can use background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure. Language structure is what I just showed you on that tree. and verbal reasoning and literacy knowledge. Literacy knowledge includes the macro structure, like what's in a story. Increasingly strategically to be able to comprehend reading. I don't think we talk about all of these components enough with our parents so that they understand what we're trying to do in school. Next slide. This is to remind you that we go back to that model that we talked about in the first meeting that we had. And if you go back to that, if you go to the second session, you'll see that when we talked about assessment, that in most schools, there are assessments for all of these little boxes. And so we need to know, as parents, we're not doing please, you're not doing those assessments, but what's going on in the school to be able to tell how your child is doing in all of these areas. Next slide. So the home is important. I've told you a lot of the things that are on this slide, but I want to really emphasize the third bullet. Quality children's books, there is research to back this up, contain more sophisticated vocabularies and sentence structures than what children are hearing on TV. So researchers have analyzed scripts from TV shows and looked at what's in children's books, and there is no comparison to what authors are putting in children's books. So we're going to move on to the next slide and talk about how we can support. We're not going to be teaching your children reading, okay? We're going to support that oral language comprehension at home. And that goes for your youngest children up to your oldest children. So for all kids, when you're speaking to your kids, try to use sophisticated language. When I say sophisticated language, I'm talking about complete sentences. Don't let your children answer you in one-word sentences. We tell teachers this all the time. Don't let kids answer with one word. Have them stretch it out and put it in a sentence. It's very difficult to write when you're not speaking in complete sentences, because written language is your thoughts put into writing. So if you think in one-word sentences, you're going to not have very sophisticated writing, and you're not going to have very sophisticated comprehension. So use appropriate labels for things. Don't be afraid to use big words with children. So don't say, oh, get me the TV thingy. It's like, please get me the remote control, okay? Teach them the labels that go with it. When my children were little and they went to the pediatrician, I remember one time the pediatrician was going, oh, and I'm just going to poke over here. And I said, time out. I said, could you please tell them what you're poking at? Like, they should be learning something while they're here. We're not doing this exam to them. We should be doing the exam with them. And he looked at me and he goes, seriously, Maureen? I go, yeah, what are you poking? Tell him. I mean, he understands. And both of my boys, this was when I had my two boys for a physical, I'll never forget it. They came home, they're talking in the car about my liver's over here, and they were only, they were preschoolers. They were 3 and 4 years old, but kids are like sponges for language. So use the real words. Ask questions of your children that require an answer, not just a yes or a no. We're all in the habit of asking yes and no questions, so we need to move out of that. Read books together. There are many ways to read books together. Read alouds. If they're readers, I read one page, you read the other page, and then dialogic reading, which we're going to go into. For your preschoolers, no matter what language you speak, singing and playing rhyming games. And people used to tell me that there were no rhymes in Spanish, and people who were fluent in Spanish told me that wasn't true. And we actually bought tons and tons of rhyming books for our Spanish-speaking children in our schools. Listening games, such as Simon Says, where kids have to listen. Dramatic play with your child, where you take on different roles. Narrating what you're doing. So when you are perhaps eating lunch, and we tell preschool teachers to do this with their children, instead of just getting whatever you're going to eat and sitting down and eating it, put language to it. Imagine saying, first I'm going to take the yogurt out of the refrigerator. A lot of words there. First, take out, right? Yogurt, not just my food. Now watch me take the top off. I'm grabbing the foil by the edge here. And see the edge? Look at all the language you just taught, just by narrating, just by like telling out loud what you're doing. Next, I'll pull the foil back. The foil is off. Look, here's the yogurt. That is so much language just by describing what you're doing. And if you do that multiple times during a week with your child, they're going to be getting a lot of good language. And by the way, your other kids will be hearing it too if you didn't do it for them. So don't feel bad if you didn't do it with older kids.
Maureen, I'm going
Yes.
to interrupt you for a minute. We have 3 minutes left.
Okay. Yep.
And I'm going to put a link to evaluation if anybody needs to leave right on the hour. Otherwise, I just want to let folks know that I'm putting that in there.
Yeah, and I apologize. We started about 6 minutes late, so but I'll catch up. Okay.
Okay.
Adding language to everyday activities. So instead of just saying, come on, we gotta go, say things like, let's put your socks on and your shoes on so that we can get to the store. Language. And encourage back and forth. Think of like a tennis match. Like I say something, you say something, I say something, you say something. See how many we call those volleys, how many volleys you can get up to. And we'll turn to the next slide. So dialogic reading. Dialogic reading is a strategy where you dialogue. You don't just read the book. Reading the book is great, but dialoguing during the book. So that means that you're reading the book with the child instead of just to the child. And while it was originally designed for like working with little kids, it works with all kids. So we're going to look at two strategies that we use in dialogic reading. We're going to go to the next slide. And the first one is called PEER. And the reason it's called PEER is because PEER stands for prompt, evaluate, expand, and repeat. And so when you prompt, you say something to the child, you say, what do you think is going on here? They can look at the picture and put language to that. And then evaluate means you think about their response. So if they were spot on, then you say, yeah, that's right. I see a teddy bear sitting on top of a whatever. If they say something that doesn't make sense, you can say like, let's look again. Yes, this is the cat, but the cat isn't on top of a cat. You're evaluating what they say and giving them correct language. Then you expand. Let's say there was a picture of a cat and the cat was in a sandbox outside on a playground. And you asked the child and they said, cat. Then you would expand that by saying, you're right. Yes, there's a cat and the cat is in a sandbox and the sandbox is on a playground. Obviously, with older kids, you're going to use a different tone of voice and you're going to be reading different types of books. And then the repeat is you repeat the prompt again. You ask the child again and see if they expand based on what you did. So very simple. We'll go to the next slide. The next strategy is called crowd. It's a little bit more advanced, and crowd stands for completion, recall, open-ended, W prompts, and distancing. And in the completion prompts, that's where you say something and you ask the child to complete, like you're reading, the Three Little Pigs, and after you say the first pig's house is made of, you just leave it off for them to complete. Recall prompts are just that. After you read a little bit, you ask the child to retell. So what did we just read? Tell me what we just heard about. And so you're building recall. Recall is super important for kids, okay? It's super important for us. Go to the next slide. Open-ended prompts. This is where you're asking questions that are not yes and no questions. They're open-ended. They're designed to promote kids' thinking when they're reading. The W prompts are the who, what, where, when, why prompts. And these are really designed so that you're asking them something specific, like who just called the mother on the phone? Why did she put the book on the table? It's very specific questioning. And then the distancing prompts are when you ask a question to get the child to get away from the book and into their own life. So let's say you were reading a book about a little girl who wanted a puppy for her birthday. Well, maybe you wouldn't want that you say, "Would you like a puppy?" Then they'll make that connection. Maybe you don't want to get a puppy, but if let's say you were reading a book and a child fell and uh, hurt their knee and had and couldn't then couldn't do something else. You might for a distancing prompt would be, um, you know, can you remember a time when you ever got hurt and couldn't go and do something that you wanted to do? Or it could be a nonfiction text that you're reading about nature and you're reading about flowers and you ask your child, do you have a favorite flower? Or, so you're distancing. And that's to get the child to think outside of the book. We're going to go to the next slide. There are many benefits to this, and they're all listed here. It's active reading. It helps kids engage with text. It's a parent-child or caregiver-child bonding experience. It improves the child's vocabulary, their ability to focus, their language skills. By asking those crowd questions, you're developing their thinking. When you do all this, you are creating new connections in their brains, and you're supporting your kids to make connections between books and their life. You can go to the next slide. So what I've tried to get at here is the importance of oral language. Language is the currency of comprehension. Think about that. Language is how you buy comprehension. On this page, I just want to give an example. If a child learns about something like so this is how authors write. After Molly woke up, she had breakfast. Then she went upstairs to make her bed. So what did Molly do first, next, and last? Because all of that is in that sentence. Kids aren't going to get that just automatically. They're not even, if they're not used to being read to, not even going to pay attention to that unless you point it out. The dog was walked by the man with the gray hair. Who had the gray hair? The dog or the man? That's syntax. That's word order. That's something we have to teach kids. The man ordered a pizza because he was hungry. Why did the man order the pizza? Or what did the man do when he got hungry? Think about that word because. If a child doesn't understand that, we call it a cohesive tie, that it's forming cohesion or alignment between two parts of a sentence and it's showing a relationship, you just don't walk into the world knowing that. We have to teach them that. But if they come into in school, and the teacher's either reading or they're able to read a word and has because, and they don't understand the function of because, they will not understand what they read. It's that simple. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So for dialogic readings, read books that your kids are going to like. Sometimes kids want to read the same book over and over and over and over again, and I'm going to beg you to go with it. And don't play games. I did. It backfired on me. My son used to want me to read every single night this horrible book called Mickey and the Giant Killer. It was a Mickey Mouse book. It was about some giant. It was long. I got tired of reading it after 150 days. And I was sitting on his bed and he was laying there and he looked like he was asleep. So I started changing the words and he opened up his eye and he goes, "You're not reading it right, Mom." Because the familiarity of the story, because he liked it, and me sitting on his bed and being with him and the comfort and the safety of that book that he knew and me, that was what he needed. And it was really about, if you know anything about mythology, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. When he got into mythology in high school, he said to me, "Remember when you used to read me that book about Mickey and the Giant Killer and pushing the rock?" It's the same as who would think that a kid would remember that from when he was that young? Okay, so don't be afraid to reread and mix and match the types of questions that you ask. And there's research on how this is really effective. In the next slide, I have put together some questions for you. In the last module, these are the same questions that you can ask when you meet in school. And so if we go to the next slide, I've provided two slides of questions that you can ask about comprehension. And I'm not going to read them through for you, but I have at the bottom, ask for examples. I'll give you one. So if you say, bullet number 4, how well is my child able to make connections when reading and listening? And if the teacher were to say, oh, really well, can you give me an example? Okay, you want to know, like, because if you're doing this at home, you kind of know what your child can do. And so you want to make sure that they're performing in school as well, and that the teacher knows, because there's a lot of kids in the class. And so you want to make those connections. Okay, the next slide is additional questions. And, is my child learning and using vocabulary words that are being taught? Like, can you give me some examples? Which is a lot nicer than saying, how do you know that? Or prove it to me. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to work with teachers. We're not trying to put them on the spot. But you do want to have evidence of how your child is doing all these things. It's very challenging, I can say, as a parent who has had a child with an IEP, to have teachers just telling you, because oh, everything's great. Oh yeah, they're doing great. Oh yeah, they're doing great. And then they're not doing so great. And they're not making progress on the IEP. And so you need to be able to say, can you give me some examples? Because you want to build on that at home. And the next slide is just a reminder that all of the components that we've talked about in all of those models, and I really hit on those models hard today, are so important. They all need to be solid, because a frayed strand, think about the rope, is a weak link. And so in a chain, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So everything in the models is important.